Duty, honor, country dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be.
The destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals.
Now, we are the masters of our fate.
Howdy, gents, and welcome to another episode of the Wolf and Iron podcast. I'm Mike Yarbrough, founder and curator of wolfandiron.com, and your host once again. My guest today is Ben Hewitt, a man who left the city life to live in almost total dependence upon the sweat of his brow and a good bit of rustic gumption. He's a farmer, a writer, a rearer of animals and children, a husband, a home builder, and anything else that's called upon a man to do who's living off the land. He's got a great story, and you can find out more about Ben at wolfandiron.com/006. I first came across Ben a few years ago, actually when I was first getting started with Wolf and Iron, and he was living a life which I just so admire, and I know a lot of guys admire as well. He's doing this thing called unschooling of his kids, which we'll talk about on the podcast, living off the land, working with his hands, and sharing that life with the world through writing. If you follow Ben's blog over at benhewitt.net, you get this great mix of like a John Burroughs lifestyle peppered with a bit of self-deprecation and sarcasm. It's just great. Just as an aside though, this was recorded back in the middle of March, so the weather was much cooler, and any seasonal references are from that time. Here's Ben Hewitt. Mr. Ben Hewitt, thank you so much for joining me today and taking the time to talk with me.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get started, I wanted to just take a moment to thank you, because when I was first getting started with Wolf and Iron, was about the same time that I came across your site, benhewitt.net, and I started kind of envying your lifestyle and the things that you were doing, both as a writer, but also as a man who's living off the land and how he's raising his family and a lot of other things that we'll talk about later. And I just reached out to you to basically say, hey, you know, what's it like doing some of the things that I would like to do successfully? And you took the time to talk with me. And that really meant a lot to me then. It was very, it was encouraging to have that conversation with you. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's totally my pleasure. Thanks. I'm glad it was worthwhile to you.
Absolutely. So for the guys who don't know what you're up to and what you're all about, give us kind of a background on you, your history, where you grew up, how you made sort of a transition into what you're doing now, some background on your family and things of that nature.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I grew up in Vermont. I was born up in St. Albans, Vermont, which is in the northwest corner of the state. And my folks were of that sort of late 60s, early 70s era, back to the land movement. So my dad had moved up here from New Jersey with $10,000 that he inherited after his father passed away, and he was writing poetry and just kind of beatniking around a little bit. But he took that money and parlayed that into, actually, believe it or not, back then, 165 acres of land with an old farmhouse that was definitely run down, but habitable, that he bought for $15,000.
Wow,
so
that's amazing.
That was sort of what that's what I was born onto. And actually, my folks ended up building a cabin and selling the farmhouse and 10 acres, but keeping the cabin and the bulk of the land. So most of my early years were in that cabin, which had no running water, no electricity. My parents were definitely full on sort of, living that life, gardens and chickens and the score.
Right.
My mom was milking cows up the road. We were definitely actually, I think, we were impoverished, but it was also, sort of that kind of lifestyle choice impoverishment, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Both my folks were pretty highly educated, but they just were sort of choosing this different lifestyle, which, of course, it was not that uncommon in that day and age. And then when I was 6 or 7, and my dad had really, at that point, had really gotten a little weary of just being broke, basically. And my dad got a job, and that job was in town of Montpelier, which was about an hour and a half away. So they ended up moving off that property. They still actually own it, but they ended up moving off that property. And so the rest of my sort of early childhood years were more sort of typically sort of rural Vermont, I guess.
Yeah.
So we still lived out in the country, but we had running water and we had electricity. We had all the typical 21st century technologies and accommodations. Sort of the next maybe formative part of my story is that I was not a great student, to put it mildly. So I actually left high school when I was 16 years old, which is the legal school leaving age in Vermont. And I spent a bunch of years just sort of working on construction crews as kind of always, or most often the low guy in the totem pole or close to the low guy in the totem pole. Pushed a lot of brooms, stacked a lot of lumber. I did sort of work my way up to it. I was actually building. I never really became what I would call a builder or a carpenter, but I definitely gained enough skills to work on my own projects, which actually I sort of mentioned that because that was, I think, in hindsight, like a really fortuitous experience.
Yeah.
And when I met my girlfriend, now wife, Penny, when I was actually working on a job site, and we ended up buying land together. I was still pretty young at that point. I was 25. She was a few years older than me, so she was 29, I guess, or so, 28, 29. And because we were fortunate enough, I had been fortunate enough to spend time on job sites and learn some of those skills. We were able to build our own place. And we were able to buy a piece of land and build a house. We did borrow some money, but we did it largely out of pocket. We paid the money off really quickly and did it mostly out of pocket. I don't know. I can keep going. You want me to keep going here? This could go on for a little while.
Well, no. It's your life story. But so when you're 25 and you bought the land, did you? Is that the land that you guys live on now?
Well, it's actually not. It's interesting. We actually, and this is something that I never, ever, ever thought would happen, but we sold that property last year. And so basically, we had so much fun spending, 18 years of our life creating the most bucolic Vermont homestead you could probably imagine, that we decided we wanted to do it over again. So we actually last year bought 100 acres of land just about a dozen miles north of that property, that original property. And I'm actually sitting right now in the main room, which is kind of the only room of an unfinished, or second owner-built unfinished house that we're working on. So we're sort of doing it all over again for a whole variety of reasons that we could probably do a whole show on in and of itself. But that's not the property. I still visit. Actually, we sold it to friends of ours, so we actually still visit the property with some frequency.
That's great. Yeah.
Which is a little strange, but also kind of great. And and it was actually a really wonderful transition. It was hard in many ways, really, really hard. But once we sort of decided that we were going to do this and make the move, it's been also just amazing, like the opportunity to build again, our life and the way we want to live has evolved over the years, and we just saw an opportunity to really do things a little differently. And fortunately for us, everything that we wanted to do differently actually meant doing it on a much smaller. I'm really hesitant. I was about to say more simple scale, but I'm really hesitant to use the word simple because I think it's an overused word. And when it comes to this lifestyle, this lifestyle, there's a lot of things about this life that are actually much, much more complex.
Yeah.
If you know what I'm saying. Yeah. But anyway, we did see an opportunity to sort of do things a little differently, and that we're more fitting with the way we wanted to live now. And so that's where we're at. And so we built last summer. We built a barn, and then we built a 1,000 square foot house that I'm in right now. And we did have some help. We didn't do that all by ourselves. But it was a really amazing experience, and the kids got to be part of it. And I can't recommend it highly enough for any of your listeners who are out there thinking should I just freaking take that leap and build my own place? And if you have the resources to do it, do it. You'll never regret it. It'll be wicked hard. It'll be hard as hell. There'll be times you'll just hate it. And in the end, it'll be the best thing you ever did.
Yeah. No, that's good. And I think a lot of times, we go into the cookie cutter houses and we take whatever is given to us. But the opportunity to build your own home, I can only imagine.
It's so true. And if you're creative, we built this place for about $35,000. not including our own labor, which certainly is a significant portion of that. And, you know, I know people who built places far less expensively than that. And I guess my point just being that, like, if you're creative, it doesn't have to cost $140 a square foot or whatever the average cost of the 21st century American home is. You can do it for a fraction of that. I know $35,000 is still a lot of money, and so I don't need to be dismissive of the finances, but it is possible to make it happen for much less than a lot of people would have you believe.
Yeah, well, and in 2016, that is an extremely low number for a home, right? So
yeah,
no matter where you go.
I know people who've done it even cheaper, who are even more resourceful than us, in some cases much more resourceful than us, and I'm totally in awe of that too. But I'm still pretty happy. I still feel pretty good about $35,000.
Yeah, that's really good.
Anyway,
so I want to ask about you're a writer as well, and you mentioned
that's right. Yeah, so I guess we kind of skipped right over that.
Yeah,
right?
Jump into that.
So I do. I mean, there's a couple of things going on here. I mean, I do write for a living. I guess to the extent that I have a career, I guess that would be it. It's really interesting as my writing career has evolved, and as my life with my family and on the land has evolved. They've really become, in many ways, pretty inseparable. So it's almost like I can't really have one without the other. Partly that's just for my emotional and spiritual well-being. Like, it's really, really important to me to be physically active and working on the land. That is really critical to me. And also partly it's just, they become, I don't think my intellect works very well either if I'm not working, outside working with the land. So, one doesn't really exist without the other, and the writing definitely is bringing in the paychecks that are enabling us to do some of the things we do around here. The other aspect is that because we do the work we do outside and on the land, our expenses are really, really low. So, I always like to joke that our living is earned largely by the money that we don't spend, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So we do grow and process an overwhelming majority of our own food. That's partly due to dietary choices too. So we're not growing like waves of grain and fields of rice and all that kind of stuff. Not that we don't eat those things, but we eat those things in pretty small quantity. And we basically have just sort of like chosen to eat that which we can produce, or either by cultivation or by hunting, foraging ourselves. So when I say things like, yeah, we eat the majority of our own food, we also eat a diet that is a little atypical, I guess, in contemporary America. So
yeah, you guys do a lot of
that aspect of it too.
You guys can and ferment and that kind of stuff?
We do a lot of fermenting. We do a little bit of canning. Mostly, when it comes to canning, it's mostly we do a bunch of applesauce. But fermenting, we're big fans of fermenting. It's just to my way of thinking, it's like the most egalitarian form of food preservation ever invented, because you basically need almost no energy inputs to make it happen. You just need some jars and some water and some salt and some vegetables or whatever your medium is there. But it's super simple. It's super cheap. You're not slaving over a stove in the middle of the harvest season. Canning, neither one of us is a fan of canning at all.
Yeah, so I grew up in the country as well. Not quite as rural as you did early on, but probably more close to your second experience, I guess, growing up. So I lived out in right on the banks of the Hatchie River in Mercer, Tennessee, and my grandparents and their parents actually lived out there. So it was just a family place, and my grandmother used to just make the kitchen so hot from canning. She would just it's awful. I mean, you just go in there, it's like a sauna, but she'd sit there and just for hours and just do it, and she still does it.
Well, it's really good for some things. There's no question about it. It's definitely a tool to have in the tool belt, I guess. But for a whole host of reasons, actually, including nutrition, it's definitely not the pinnacle of food preservation as far as I'm concerned. So.
Yeah, and we could probably have a whole conversation about the benefits of fermented food and stuff. We might have to say that for another time. But there is a lot of studies coming out, or there are a lot of studies coming out right now that have been talking about how, because we're missing this from our diet, which used to be such a normal part of our diet, that
Right.
our guts are just all messed up, and
They're
maybe
totally messed up. I mean, from eating sterilized food, from living in sterilized environments, from antibiotics, there's a whole host of reasons. But, the health implications go much beyond our digestive tract, that's for sure. It's really, really fascinating stuff. And it's great to see sort of the mainstream medical. Oh, you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, I don't know if you heard that, but
Yeah, I did.
You might have to edit it out. Anyway, it's really interesting to see the mainstream medical community finally sort of coming to terms with this, because this is something that, like, the so-called quacks have been saying for decades.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
That we need to be consuming these foods, and that this is really critical. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, maybe you were right.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think it's not a coincidence that that's coordinating with a lot of ability to make money off of some of some of these things, right?
That's probably true too. Yeah, but one of the beautiful things about fermenting and is that it is really, really cheap to do. So people can do this and can actually create an environment where they have access to these beneficial bacteria really, really simply and really inexpensively. But yeah, you're right. I'm sure there's going to be all sorts of supplements coming down the pike that
yeah. How to do this stuff for $5 that your grandparents did for free.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's good either way, I guess, if people can get on board with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to talk about Finn and Rye a bit, because you got two boys, and
right.
I think they're growing up in an experience that's really unlike anything that, well, at least the kids that we know and the vast majority of kids are experiencing. Tell us like what their ages are and kind of what their day looks like.
So yeah, there are Finn is 14 and Rye is 11. And so I guess, probably part of the experience you're probably speaking of is the fact that they are educated at home and in the woods and also in the company of a number of different mentors, both near and far. But so they don't go to school. We don't really follow any kind of prescribed curriculum, and they have a lot of autonomy. And their days really can take on a variety of shapes. And forms. I get asked this question a lot, and it's a little bit of a tough one to answer in a way, because our days are so seasonal. Our life is so seasonally based, basically, and so things are constantly sort of shifting up around here according to the season. So we've just sort of coming out of our winter hibernation, so to speak. And I'm going to spend, after we get off the phone, I'll probably spend the rest of the day outside, doing firewood. The rest of my family is actually off visiting my mother-in-law, so they're not around. But if they were around, they would probably be spending a lot of time outside. There would be some chores that we would be sort of expecting them to do, or some projects that we would be expecting them to help with. But they have a lot of time, a lot of autonomy to sort of follow their own interests. They're both really avid outdoorsmen, hunters and trappers, so they spend a lot of time in the woods. Our oldest son, Finn, is a really aspiring musician. He's a self-taught guitar player, and so he plays guitar, fairly obsessively, often many, many hours a day. They're both really, really avid readers, so they will definitely, and a little bit less so, of course, this time of year because the weather's shifting, but particularly in the winter, it's really, really not uncommon for them to read, multiple hours a day. So yeah, they spend a lot of time out on the land, sort of wandering around. I think in many ways it would be maybe what people would have in their mind, from a childhood of out of the American 1950s or something like that.
Sure.
So they might be out hunting squirrels, or they might be out building a shelter in the woods. Not so much now. They're sort of that phase of building shelters and whatnot as sort of playhouses. They're sort of growing past that. But that's the way they have been spending their time over many, many years now. And it's just, we've really sort of, I was talking to someone yesterday about this and how to define the way we look at their education and our role as their educators. And sometimes I find it really, really hard to talk about in a way, because it's really nuanced. It's not, some people hear the term unschooling, which is sort of the most popular term, I guess, for what we do, even though I don't really like that term. But some people hear that, and I think they assume that there is no adult oversight.
Right.
That's definitely not the case in our family. So there's a couple of terms that I use a lot to help people understand what it is. And one is that we really consider ourselves the facilitators of their learning rather than sort of the masters of it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And the other is that, while I look at the contemporary institutionalized education system as trying to make learning happen, it's really trying to compel learning to happen. We're just trying to make room for learning to happen. So to create that space in their days and in their lives, so that they have the opportunity to really go deep into the things that they're actually interested in. I don't know what your experience was with public education, but my experience was that, when I was sat down and told what I had to learn and how I had to learn it, it was really not a very good way to get me to learn something or to try to convince me that I need to learn. I mean, any parent knows, like, the best way to get your child to hate a particular food is to force them to eat it.
That's right.
And, some kids seem to really thrive in that environment where they just don't have to think too hard about what it is, and they can just sort of like buckle down, and they do really well in that environment. I was not one of those. My wife was not one of those kids. And I think, actually, my guess is that the majority of children in the public education system are not that type. There are some that really do thrive and are real standouts, but the majority, I think, really struggle. And so, yeah, we're really looking for opportunities to make room for learning to happen rather than to make it happen.
I think that's a really good point. You and I grew up with the same sort of report cards, so to speak. I mean, it was I was pretty abysmal as a student, but I wasn't stupid. And the issue was exactly what you said. I didn't want to learn things just for the sake of learning. There needed to be a drive beyond that. History, for example. I love history now as an adult because I get a chance to really dig into it as I want to and to see how it all folds together. But as a kid, they're just trying to push dates on you and things like that, and they kind of miss the story. And there's so many other subjects that are exactly the same way. And I find that as an adult, and I think this is probably true, I know it's true with my kids, is that when I have a natural interest that peaks, whether it's because of I've reached an age of maturity or some things have come together to shine the light on some area of life that I find interesting, it's like the vaults of my mind open and I can just absorb information, right?
Right.
But, if you were to say, hey, learn these things because you need to make a good grade on this test, it just shuts down. And I think
sure,
you're right.
And it's just, but you end up in this place of like, I'm just going to memorize what I need to memorize in order to pass this test, and then as soon as the test is passed, and you're on to the next thing, memorizing the next thing to pass the next test, you've forgotten all of that. I mean, how much do people actually remember of any of this, so-called learning that they do during these years? My guess, certainly in my case, very little, and my guess is that in the case of most, very little. And so, when people get sort of all up in arms and concerned about the things that children who, have this autonomy and like my own, and there are many others out there, but what about this and what about that? And, my point is, one of my points is, look, sure, we could send them to school and we could force them to quote unquote learn that stuff. But I can all but guarantee you that by the time they're 20 years old, and probably much sooner than that, they will have forgotten everything that we forced them to supposedly learn.
Yeah.
And it will have done them little good. And in fact, will have been a huge freaking waste of time,
And I think that's, I think there's a lot of lessons we could take out of that, just that one piece right there, Ben, because I think that's a very manly way of approaching life, in that you said, I'm going to go against the grain. I'm going to do the thing that's not popular because I have a strong belief that it's not actually beneficial, regardless that it is the system that everybody pretty much follows into. I don't really think that is the best system, and I think that there's a better way to do something different for my own kids. So I think that's really good that you were able to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, and I will point out one thing is that I don't, I say all this, with full awareness that it may not be the right thing for other people,
sure.
Right? So,
yeah.
So I always like to make it clear that, like, I'm not offering a prescription for anyone else's path in life. far be it for me to. And also that this is not perfect. I'm not sitting here saying that like what we're doing is perfect, that my kids are perfect, or any of that. I mean, this is all a journey, and we, as much as anyone else, are trying to figure it out. So I just like, I really want to make that clear too, and I don't want anyone to think that like, we feel like we've got it all figured out. We are making choices based on our experiences and observations. And sometimes those experiences and observations lead us in different ways, and our ideas evolve. I mean, I think one of the most dangerous things is to become so dogmatic about an idea or ideology that you don't stay open to other ideas.
Sure.
That said, feel really fortunate that we are able to provide this for our kids, and I have to say for ourselves. I mean, this is a huge opportunity for us as parents and adults, and the amount of learning that we have done alongside our kids, I would be hard pressed to overstate that. That aspect of it, in and of itself, while maybe seeming somewhat selfish and self-absorbed, is also a really, really nice piece of keeping our kids at home.
Sure.
And they do have the choice. I mean, I will also point out that we certainly are not compelling them to stay at home if they wanted to go to school, or if they wanted to follow a different path. Those options are there. They have absolutely no interest in that. But that is an option if they decided to do so.
Gotcha. Good. You mentioned a few minutes ago that your mind doesn't quite work right unless you've been out working the land and doing some labor when it comes to writing or just thinking. And I think that's true of everybody, especially for guys. How do you think that works? Like, why is that the case?
Wow. Well, I mean, I'm sure there's all sorts of chemical reactions that are going on that I don't really understand, hormonal, chemical, whatever. I just remember from when I was, one part of my story that we didn't get to in the earlier days, that I was a really avid backcountry skier and cyclist, and so I'm really familiar with that sort of runner's high, that endorphin high that people get. So I know that there, from physical labor comes a certain sort of chemical reaction in the body, brain, and so there's some piece of that for sure, but I also think it goes much deeper than that, and that for me, to really feel connected in other aspects of my life, it's also really important for me to feel connected with the land, and also because I'm a livestock farmer, we have cows and pigs and chickens and whatnot. Those connections with my animals, those relationships with my animals are super, super important to me. So. These are things that just feed me on so many different levels. I've often joked to people that the food is sort of like a fringe benefit. It's like we go to all this quote unquote work, right, in order to raise the food, and I'm at the point where I say even if the food were not there at the end, I would probably want to do this. I don't know that I would. I probably need that sort of reward, right, to compel me to go out on a day when there are days, when it's 37 degrees and it's pouring rain. It's like the last thing I want to do is get up and go do chores first thing in the morning. But of course, I'm never sorry that I had to do that.
Yeah.
Right? Never, in the end, sorry that I had to do that. There are days, it's like we heat only with firewood, so that means, I've got to get the firewood in, and there are days when, I don't know, maybe I don't really feel like going out and splitting firewood, right? Split by hand. Again, it's like, am I ever sorry that I had to go do that? And I guess the analogy maybe would be that it's like, the guy who wakes up and forces himself to go out for a 5-mile run before he goes to work. It's just that, for me, I really appreciate having been involved in athletics and that being a huge part of my life for a period of my life, and not being much a part of it now. There is, for me anyway, a somewhat more sort of holistic feeling of connection and well-being that comes of the kind of labors that I'm talking about that are not necessarily athletic, but are still very, very physical. And I'm probably not doing a very good job of describing that, maybe because I don't really understand it entirely.
Yeah, well,
but it's really meaningful for me, and it is, it's like to spend a day working on a house, building a house, or, I spent yesterday, we're clearing off some land, some wooded land for planting some perennial food crops, and, to see that transition, to see something tangible result from your efforts. There is something to that, even though, I was just joking about, the food being a fringe benefit. There is a real truth to the fact that you can actually see something emerge from your efforts.
Yeah.
That I feel like, in contemporary America, or probably any contemporary first world, economy, the opportunities for that are fewer and further between.
Mm-hmm.
Because so much of our work is sort of service and tech based. And I'm not denigrating any of that. It's like I know there are people out there who probably realize the same sort of satisfaction from that work as I realize from mine. It's just that that's not that satisfying to me. And there are, and I hear from enough people who are really, I think, are seeking that sense of having done something with their hands and had that thing take shape before them. I think I'm probably not the only one who feels that way, I guess.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Actually, I wrote an article that's along these lines about a week or two ago. It's called Raising Children in a Society That Raises Nothing. And the idea was that, when a lot of people, when we're thrown into raising kids, it's the first thing we've ever raised. We haven't had we've not raised chickens or dogs or plants or a garden or anything, right? And so we're really just struck over the head with this. This is how nature actually works. It's all coming at you at once, and you've got your ship fully loaded with people who are dependent upon you, and you better get this figured out.
Right.
And so I think that what you're doing actually, and particularly, it's definitely beneficial for you and Penny, but that you're sharing the story is important, but also that your boys are growing up in a world where they've raised things and they have an idea of, okay, there's actually hard work that's involved here. It's not always going to come easy. And not only that, but there are rewards that are difficult to explain, just like we talked about, just trying to figure out why is it that when a man goes out or a woman goes out and does work the old-fashioned way, that there are benefits to it that are really difficult to kind of put our hands around, but we know that they're real.
Right.
So I think that's awesome.
And to me, sometimes I think maybe it's we shouldn't really try too hard to explain them. We should just accept it and enjoy it. And sometimes, the harder I feel like sometimes the harder I try to explain things, it's almost like you can somehow color it in a way by trying to explain it, and maybe it's just better to accept that the sort of I don't know, the mystery is maybe too strong a word, or maybe not. Just accept it that it is somewhat inexplicable, but that makes it nonetheless real. We live in a really sort of science and logic based culture, and so I think we're always sort of searching for those ways to quantify and understand things. And there are times, I guess, when I think that's really valuable, and there are other times when it's more valuable to say, hey, I don't really understand this, but I know it's real. Yeah. And that's good. That's plenty. That's enough.
Yeah, that's really good. I want to jump to something else before we run out of time that I think is kind of a hard thing for people to grasp. And I think you have a unique perspective on this because you've been you're raised on the farm, and then you kind of left it for a while, and then you came back. And that's raising animals that you genuinely care for and that you look after sometimes for years, knowing that one day they're going to be dinner,
Right.
And I grew up hunting. We didn't raise a lot of stuff. We had some rabbits for a while. Those eventually went away, but I remember going out, and talking to the rabbits, and, they were small and you could pet them and stuff like that. And then eventually my grandfather would come out and just knock one over the head to kill it. And, we'd have rabbit nuggets. Right. And, and it's delicious, but it was growing up with it is different than, I guess, a lot of people now, if they had to go back to doing that, just getting over that and trying to understand how so many people have been taught that that's cruel, that it's evil in a sense. But there's not, we're deeper than that. And I kind of wanted to get your perspective on what that was like and what that's still like for you.
Yeah, well, it's another big hairy topic that we could spend a lot of time on, but it's certainly been an evolution. I remember the first time we raised pigs, which was probably 20 years ago now. And the night before we were going to slaughter, I had this really, really vivid dream of I'd taken the pigs. This is when I was still working part-time in a bike and ski shop, and I was just really starting to write for money. And I'd taken the pigs somehow to work with me, and I had them in this cage, out behind the bike shop. And then I was going out, on the hour, every hour, to feed them and pet them, and then I left work and somehow forgot them. And I remember waking up in the middle of the night, just in this panic that I'd left the pigs in this cage in town. And you don't have to do a whole lot of dream therapy to sort of see what was going on there, right? And it was, it's not hard for me anymore. That's not to say it's not sort of emotionally fraught. I definitely have a period when I'm preparing to kill and just before I kill, that is definitely, I'm anxious, and I don't, I'm trying to think I certainly don't really feel grief. I mean, I recognize, look, life doesn't, we don't live because we let other things live. I mean, things have to die in order for us to live.
Right.
But that's just the way it is. And it doesn't matter what kind of diet you're consuming, things are dying in order for you to live. Actually, there's all sorts of really interesting research on the ability of plants to actually feel pain and have sensation that we previously not understood them to have.
Right.
But never mind the plants. I mean, cultivating any kind of crop, things are dying all the time so that any of us can live, no matter what our diets are. And so, we choose to eat meat where it's really clear to us that is the most healthful diet for us, not just for us, but also for our land. And this is another aspect of this that is so often sort of glossed over and misunderstood, largely because the dominant meat and dairy industries are, they're despicable, frankly.
Yeah.
And so people have this concept that that's how animals have to be raised. In confinement, in deplorable conditions, creating a waste management problem. Whereas the way we raise animals on pasture, on the land, they are actually contributing to the health of our property, of our land, in really, really profound ways, and are essential to that health. So people often forget that one of the most important products that animals bring, that livestock bring to the food ecosystem, is fertility.
Yeah.
And the only reason they've been able to forget that is because we have created all these processes for synthesizing fertility using fossil fuels, right?
Yeah.
So, before that, it was animals, and it was green manure crops, cover crops.
Yeah.
And that's how you did it, and that's still how you do it. So, animals raised, just to address really quickly the sustainability aspect of this, if anyone's interested in that, but animals raised on pasture are the most sustainable form of agriculture there is. They are consuming a perennial product or crop, grass, right, that we don't even have to cultivate, and turning that into food for us. So I like to sort of joke that I'm a vegan. I'm actually a vegan. I eat mostly grass. I just need it to pass through the digestive tract of the ruminant animal first, right? So anyway, but from an emotional standpoint, I think, so once you start to sort of make these connections and understand this, that it's not life that makes life, it's death that makes life, right? So there's this thing, we got to embrace that understanding and awareness and acceptance of death. We have to get past our fear of death, right? So there's that. Animals are essential to a functional ecosystem of which humans are a part, okay? So it's not like we can put all these animals in zoos, or we can just create all these pet sanctuaries where we'll run out of room on the planet, right? If we're going to do that.
Yeah.
So when you start to sort of just accept the underlying truth at the basis of our life in this world, you start to sort of realize that this is the way it is. This is the way it's going to be. We have personally chosen to take responsibility for that, and to really actually value our role in the process, as hard as it can sometimes be. Actually, it's funny, we're talking about this right now. We just 2 days ago finished killing and processing 2 pigs right here in the same room. So there was one other point I was going to make, but it slipped my mind now. Oh, just in terms of like, animals that, like, loving animals and caring for animals and taking their life. I'd much rather take the life of an animal that I have loved and cared for than one that I haven't loved and cared for, frankly.
Wow.
That to me seems like an essential part of the process.
Right.
Having a certain reverence for them, to me, includes, an element of love and gratitude for what they're doing for us. And so, I no longer see, I did originally see those as sort of being the idea that you could love this creature and also kill it and eat it. I once saw those as being, I guess, in opposition of one another. I don't feel that way at all anymore. And in fact, I almost feel as if, like, how could I kill and eat an animal that I hadn't loved? That to me seems like the greater crime at this point in my life.
Wow. No, man, thank you so much for bringing that to our, that perspective, because we have lost that, I think, in a lot of ways. The typical way we think about it now is that you kill the things that you hate, Yeah,
that's a really interesting point. Right,
yeah.
Right.
And
kill the terrorist, man. Kill the terrorist.
Yeah, kill all the
right?
bad guys. Yeah, everything that's bad, you kill it.
Yeah.
But even grown up hunters would understand this too. I mean, you go out, you hunt. There's a beauty about the whole process. There's a beauty about the animal, and there's a gratefulness there as well.
It's really interesting, like living in a rural area, and a blue-collar rural area at that, where a lot of people still hunt, not just for sport, but to actually put food on the table.
Sure.
A lot of these people understand this stuff intrinsically.
Yeah.
They may not, like, articulate it, right, in the same way, because they maybe were just not raised in a culture where people really articulated that, but it's just part of them, right?
Yeah.
They don't feel the need to sort of like sit around and like tease out all these nuances.
Sure.
They just know. And I guess if pressed, they could probably express it or would express it, but it's just a part of who they are, and they get it, for lack of a better word. But in Vermont, as in most places, hunting's on the decline. There are fewer and fewer people who are living any sort of life connected with the reality of living on the land. And I feel really fortunate that there's still as much of that happening here as there is, but it's definitely on the decline.
Right.
So that awareness, I think, is subsequently sort of slowly eroding from our sort of cultural understanding of what it means to live. It's like the author Daniel Quinn talks about, like, the great forgetting. And this is part, I think, of the great forgetting. There's a lot of things that are part of the great forgetting, but this is a big one.
I'm just actually writing that down. That's really good.
Yeah. So for any of your listeners who haven't read Ishmael or My Ishmael, there's 2 books by Daniel Quinn. They're really sort of almost companion books, but you could read either or. They don't need to be read in any necessarily in any particular order. Those are really, really, really profound books that will touch, actually, I think, in some ways, much more elegantly and articulately than we've been talking today, but we'll touch on a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. And they're really wonderful books. I highly recommend them.
Thanks. I'll definitely check those out. 2 last questions.
Sure.
One, is the sugar running right now up in Vermont?
Yeah, it is actually. We left our sort of proper syrup rig back at our old property. So right now I'm boiling on the wood cook stove that we use to heat with and cook with. So I've got sap going right now, actually.
Oh.
So yeah,
That's
we're right
awesome.
in the thick of it.
Every time you write an article and you mention anything about maple syrup, I don't care what time of day it is that I'm reading the article, it's breakfast time.
Yeah, right.
And
I know, it's good stuff.
Yeah,
good
golly,
stuff.
I can't. Yeah. Here in North Carolina, the seasons are too temperamental. There's a small window of time to pull sap, but it really such a short season. So,
do people sugar like up in the mountains and up where it's colder? Yeah,
they do.
Right.
But I think what would be big around here would be sorghum molasses. Right. So, which is just itself is awesome. It tastes like caramel.
All right.
It's amazing, but it's not quite the same thing as maple syrup, and We don't have a lot of sugar maples around here. We have a lot more just regular, maybe some silver maples and things like that.
Yep.
But I mean, which can be used, but they're just not they don't have as much of the
Right. The sugar content's much lower.
So,
right.
But anyhow, every time I read one of your articles, I get really hungry. So, and jealous as well. So, also the last question I want to end on was this: what has it meant to you as a man? I guess just in your own heart, to have made the transition in life that you did, and to do these things that people would say are just. It's not like you went out and you got a little bit of land and you started a garden. You've made big changes, both to how you raise your kids, how your family's organized, and so many other things. What has it meant to you to do that?
I mean, I will say that like it almost is like we just got a little bit of land, started a garden in a way, because that's kind of how it all began.
Sure.
You know? And so it wasn't like, Penny and I came to that piece of land thinking like, oh my God, we're going to have, 8 cows and 5 pigs and grow all our food and 100 blueberry plants, and we're going to sugar and we're going to raise our kids at home, educate our kids at home. And
right.
It wasn't like that at all. It has been much more of evolution process.
Okay.
And so in a way it's hard for me to talk about it in terms of transition, because there never was this sort of like turning point, if that makes any sense, where we were just like, this is, we had this idea that we wanted to live on the land on some level or another. But really, I often joke that it's all started because we just wanted a big enough piece of land that we could go out in our front yard and take a piss without the neighbors seeing us, right?
Right.
Bothering us, and that's very facetious. It's not true at all, but there is a larger truth to it, I guess, in that like we weren't sort of this wasn't all laid out and mapped out for us, and it's just been sort of an evolution, and. When I look back on it, sometimes I'm a little bit like, it's almost sometimes a little overwhelming to me. Like, whoa, I never really intended for this, and
Sure.
Here it is, and it's really wonderful. And I sort of feel like at this point, I lack a certain context to answer that question very articulately, because this is what I've been doing for a long time.
Yeah.
20 plus years, 20 years, I guess. The basis of my story is it's all sort of here. It's all still sort of unfolding. I don't have any sort of like, again, I didn't have that sort of like light bulb moment where it's like, I got to get out of one life and into another.
Sure.
Right. That's not what happened. It was just, and also, I grew up, even though the majority of my childhood, so there was those early years when I did live a more sort of rustic back to land existence, the majority of my childhood was much more sort of modern rural America. But it was also, I grew up in a community where a lot of the things we're doing, fewer and fewer people were doing them, but we hadn't lost a lot of that sort of land-based ethos and that connection to the land, and it still exists around here to a great extent, which is one of the reasons we choose to live here, frankly.
Yeah.
So in other words, none of this was super mysterious to me in a sense, right? There was a lot of that sort of embedded intellectual property in terms of like just the knowledge. I mean, this is one of the things that like I think about a lot for people, is just how and I know how overwhelming it is to me sometimes to like think about all the things that I don't know and probably never will know, and all the skills that most of our friends are craftsmen on some level or another, and their skills in that particular craft generally far exceed ours. Right? So, so it can be really overwhelming even for me to think about like all the skills that I'll never master and never even know. That said, it's like, and I want to say this because I really mean it, but also because I don't want anyone to feel discouraged if they want to seek out some sort of version of a land-based life for themselves. You don't need to be tremendously skilled to do this. You can figure it out. None of this stuff is all that hard. And so, I mean, it's really true that, it's such a cliche to say, like, if I can do it, anyone can do it. But that's really true. I'm not a naturally sort of skilled person with my hands, but I've managed to pull this off, just mostly through, like, persistence with a lot of help. But, it's not, none of this is that hard. You just need to have some capacity and desire for physical work, and some resources, I guess, to get yourself going. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that much. Again, it's like I know people who are doing this on even more of a shoestring than we are. So there's a lot of opportunity out there for people to do similar things. Again, not the same. I mean, this is like our version of this life. Yours doesn't have to look like this at all. No one's does.
Well, that's good, and I think that's a good way to close, because there are a lot of people who are wanting to transition to more of the rustic life, and knowing that you can do it gradually, and not necessarily knowing where you're going to end up, over the next 10 or 15 years, is good. It's a good way to start, and so it's good to hear that that you didn't just start with a fully furnished farm and all this chores to do and and all that. So it's good.
Yeah, and in fact, I would say it's better not to. And some I look at, like, we've kind of had to do things. This building this place has been a little bit of an exception. We had some money because we had equity in our other place, and so we sort of had to do it quickly because we had to get out of here, get out of the other place to close on it. But generally speaking, in a lot of ways, I see that it's been really beneficial to be forced to do things slowly for a lack of financial resources. Because it's sort of compelled us to be a little bit more deliberate and to really think about how we want things to unfold rather than to just sort of, run nilly-willy into it, which I think in and of itself can be super, super overwhelming. But being patient and letting things unfold really slowly is absolutely fine. And in many cases, preferable. So there's that too. Yeah.
Well, Ben, I really appreciate the time talking to you. I think that you've got an amazing point of view in the world that we sorely need, and that and I appreciate you sharing your story. I appreciate reading your articles, and I certainly encourage people to go check out benhewitt.net and take a look at the books that you have out there, which really unfold a lot of things that we've talked about, and really get into a lot more detail about some of the specifics on whether it's unschooling or what have you. I look forward to talking to you, and good luck out there today.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks a lot.
Take care. Thank you.
Right, bye. Well, there you go, men. If you feel called to quit the cubicle and head out to the field, you still can. Ben has written a number of books which you'll want to check out, so head over to wolfandiron.com/006 to find out more. And until we talk again, keep your powder dry, and may a fair wind be always in your sails.